Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we'll be reviewing tips for the removal and replacement of the brake pads and brake rotors on this 2023 Nissan Versa with the 1.6 liter engine. If you find my tips to be helpful, please like, subscribe, and comment. Now let's get started. Before we get started, I just want to point out a couple of things. Right here, you have your brake caliper. Here's your brake rotor. And then right inside here are your brake pads. And we'll be able to see them better in a minute. Some of the symptoms associated with failing brake pads or rotors include squealing or chirping. And a chirping sound is what you might hear is kind of chirp, 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 chirp when you're driving down the street, or you might only hear it when you apply the brakes. So just that 50 feet before you stop at the stoplight, you hear the chirp, chirp, screech, chirp, chirp, screech. And that is the time when you want to change your brake pads. When the sound, that chirping sound is intermittent. Because if you wait for a longer period of time, say more than 1,000 miles, it's likely that you're going to damage your rotors, and that makes the brake job a lot more expensive. Grinding noise. If you hear grinding noise like metal on metal, if you can imagine just dragging a flat shovel across the sidewalk, that's the sound, the grinding sound. That's the metal against another hard surface. And that means that your brake pads are beyond their limits. The back of the brake pad is rubbing onto the rotor and it's destroying the rotor. Pulsations in the pedal. So if you have pulsing in the pedal when you put on the brakes, and it's a little bit hard to tell nowadays, most cars have anti-lock brakes. When you step on the brakes and you hear a boom, 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 that is a sign that your rotor is warped. At some point you've overheated your rotor, and you'll see that uneven wear in your brake pads too. So instead of when you take your brake pads off, the brake pads won't have the same depth or thickness all the way across, and that's an indicator that your rotor is warped. It doesn't rotate evenly. You have a warning light. The brake light warning means that you likely have low fluid. I'm going to kind of move over. The fill port is right back here. And then you have your .3 brake fluid. Brake fluid, you shouldn't keep it for a very long time because it does absorb water. So if you bought brake fluid, say 5 years ago, and you haven't used all of it, chances are it may not be good, okay? So I just want you to know that brake fluid does absorb water. It's usually a smarter move just to buy a smaller container of brake fluid. But if you're changing brakes on a regular basis, you can go ahead and get a brake fluid container at about this size. I also want you to notice that I removed the cap on the brake fluid reservoir because when I compress the piston in the brake caliper, that fluid has to go somewhere and it's going to push back into the brake fluid reservoir, and that's why I have the cap off, okay? So just take a note of that right now. So let's move back over. Okay, so what else I want to cover here? So that's the brake fluid warning light. I talked about the brake fluid. I talked about removing the cap on the brake fluid reservoir before removing the brake pads and compressing the piston. But lastly, I just want to say that brake pads and brakes should be inspected about every 5,000 miles. So every time you change the oil on your vehicle, you should stop and take a look at the condition of your brake pads and rotors. And typically when you go to one of these Jiffy Lube type places or quickie oil change type places, one of the things you're paying for in that price is a brake inspection. And typically a brake inspection is included with an oil change. Okay, and so there's value to that. Even though you're getting your brakes inspected, say every 4 to 6 months, it's likely that your brakes will only last between 30 and 70,000 miles. Probably about 50,000 miles, you should start making plans to, at a minimum, change your brake pads and possibly change your rotors. I'm gonna go ahead and start removing and replacing parts here. I'm gonna try to minimize my talking, so let's see how I do. So the first thing I'm going to do here is remove the back side of the brake caliper so that I can expose the brake pads. And so there's two bolts here, and here. I've already loosened them up. And so this is a 14mm socket, okay? And it just slides off. This is a pressurized fluid hose, so do not let this just hang. You always want to put it somewhere so that it rests just like that. Okay, so now we have our brake pads exposed. There's the inner brake pad, there's the outer brake pad, and then there's the rotor. And this is what they call a vented rotor because there's vents in between the rotor. In the older cars just had one single blade and it wasn't vented. And a lot of times those rotors became warped. But the venting does two things. It helps keep the rotor cool and also helps to prevent warping, okay? I'm going to remove this pad first, and what I'm gonna do is just slide it out of the bottom. If you notice, you can just, there's an opening. The way that the brackets are set up here, you can't really slide it out of the top. You can slide it out of the bottom very easy. And so I'm just sliding it, and there you go, and it just drops down like that. And so what you have is the back of the brake pad. There's the metal piece. And what I want to show you is the thickness of the pad. And you can see that the thickness of the pad is even. I hope you guys can see that. I'll put my glove there so you can see a contrast. But the pad is even. So that tells me that this rotor is not warped. Okay? If it was warped, the pad would be thin on one side and thick on the other. Okay? Okay, so when you're taking these pads off, make sure you set them down on the ground in a way that allows you to remember which one was the outer pad and which one's the inner pad. I'm going to set that straight down, slightly to the outside. Same thing here. Now with this pad, if you look at the bracket is just the opposite. So push down on the bottom part of the pad and pushed it out that way, okay? Now I'm taking a look at the pad, showing you guys the contrast. There's no unevenness in the pad. It's in pretty good condition. I want to point out at this time that this is the device that chirps right here, okay? So this does not come off of the back of the pad. This is built onto the pad, but this is the device that chirps. So if you can imagine that when the rotor, when this pad wears down, 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 at one point, there's going to be a slight unevenness to the rotor. I mean, we're talking micrometers. That's all it takes to slightly rub on this and chirp. Chirp, 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 chirp. And when you press on the brakes, it chirp, 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 chirp. So that's your early warning indicator. And you can see that it's slightly above the metal backing on the brake pad itself. So what that does is prevent you from having metal on metal and destroying your rotor. So next, we're going to remove the rotor. I'm going to use this 11/16 socket on these two bolts right here. And they're loose. Okay, they have to come all the way out. Okay, just grab this, and you'll notice that there are brackets still in place. They need to stay in place unless you're going to replace them. And you always replace them with the exact same brackets. And then you simply pull off the rotor, just like that. Okay? There are videos that talk about when and whether a rotor should be replaced. I'm just going to say that this rotor is in really good working condition. I don't see any deep grooves in here, and that's really what I'd be looking for. If you put it on a machine, there's a very small bevel here. You can only and legally grind this rotor down so that it reaches a certain thickness. And then after that, you have to throw it away and replace it. And there's a bevel, a very small bevel that really provides a guide. And once you no longer have a bevel, that means you've reached the thinness or the thickness that you can't go beyond, okay? So I'm just gonna go ahead and put it on. There you go. So while I have full access to the rotor, I'm going to clean the rotor now that I've handled the rotor, because even a little oil from your hands or some oil picked up from the job from the floor can get onto the rotor. And if that gets on the rotor, it's going to get onto your brake pads and it's going to cause uneven wear. Okay, so I don't have any brake cleaner, so I'm going to use the next best thing, which is engine degreaser. And I'm simply just going to clean this rotor. Okay. I'm just going to clean it off just like that. Now once again, if I had brake cleaner, that's what I should be doing. That's what I would be using. Okay, but this is engine degreaser. Pretty much does the same thing. And you see how much dirt is coming off of that rotor. But honestly, it's just brake dust, it's not oil, so it's not overly concerning, but I just want to make the point to you guys that this rotor needs to be clean before you reinstall it. So now what I'm going to do is start to reassemble everything. So I'm going to reinstall the inner portion of the brake caliper using the large bolts. You'll note that even though these bolts are a little bit sticky, I'm not putting oil on them. That's a major no-no. Never put any oil on any of the bolts associated with brakes. These are heat-treated bolts. They're made to work in this high temperature condition. You cannot substitute similar bolts on the brake calipers. Go ahead and tighten it up. So basically I do snug and then about a half turn. And so in preparation for installing the caliper piston, I need to lube up these two glides very carefully. See how I kind of held the rubber back and then I'm sliding out the slide. Hold the rubber back, slide out the slide. Just like that. And then I'm going to take some lithium grease and put a liberal amount of lithium grease on the slides. Okay? And then put them back in place. And you could kind of turn it a little bit and then push it all the way in and it kind of just snap in place just like that. Same thing here. Slide it out. You can see that one was kind of dry. There you go. Slide it in carefully, twist, 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 and then click, and then you see the rubber forms a nice seal right here. Okay? If we've gone through all the trouble of removing the brake pads, we're going to install brand new ones. And new brake pads will be thicker than the old ones, right? Therefore, you must make space for them. And how do we do that? So we have to compress this piston right here so that it will allow space for the thickness of the new pads. This is a kit that you can get on loan for AutoZone, but you can also buy it. And so let me just show you how it works. So I'm going to show you everything because it doesn't really come with good instructions. Okay, so that's basically what it looks like when you open it up. Okay, and you say to yourself, okay, what do I do? And so this is my version of what do you do. So you're gonna need a disc that's at least the size of the piston itself. And so here you go, okay? And then you need this piece, and you're wondering to yourself, okay, you got this one and this one. How does this work? This seems a little odd. I can't get this on here. How does, oh, wait, hey, I think I'm onto something. And there you go. So I'm having a little fun with you guys, but this is how it works. So you open it up just a little bit. Maybe you see that? Not that much. And then you simply slide this. Hope you guys can see that. You slide this up, over, and just like that, right? And now, you see those two little dots? Put them into place just like that. Since this doesn't have any grooves or like an X on it, you would use the flat side. However, if this had an X on it, it has to be turned while it turns as it compresses. This one simply compresses. It does not need to turn as it compresses. But if you need to rotate, some pistons must be rotated in order to compress them. Then you would flip this, right? And what would happen is that, let's say this one right here, okay? That would catch onto the X, and then when you turn this, it would rotate the piston and compress it. Can you guys see that? Can you see how that would work? Okay, you see how that rotates? And as you press it, it rotates and compresses it. All right? If you got questions on that, send me a comment. That's not our case, so slap that on there like that. There you go. Hold it. Reduce the space a little bit, and there you go. And you see how it fits right in there like that. Now I'm actually starting to compress it already. Now, you could put like a crescent wrench right here, or just try to hold it with your hand. And you see it's compressing. And while you're compressing, what you want to watch out for is that this rubber gasket here on the outside of the piston, make sure that doesn't start to twist. For pistons that don't twist as they compress, they don't have the X on them, you're probably not going to have that problem. But for pistons that require you to rotate them, sometimes this rubber gasket here starts to twist and bind, and you don't want that. And so if you see that twisting and binding, only thing you have to do is apply some lithium grease all along here. Like, so you'd want to just apply some lithium grease and just kind of use your finger and jam it in there, and it'll release those pieces of rubber that are kind of catching on the outside of the piston. Okay, that's as simple you can do, and it works every time for me. Okay, so go ahead and compress this piston. So let's assume that you have brand new brake pads, so you need to compress this piston all the way. I'm being a little lazy here, I guess I could get, oh. You guys see that? That rubber, you saw the rubber pop out a little bit there? Okay, so I backed it out immediately. So what I'm gonna do is slide this out, and then I'm gonna kind of massage it into place. I could put some lithium grease on here if it's real bad, but this doesn't look too bad. Okay, all right. And I go back in. And that's it. So that's fully compressed. You can take this off. Take this apart. And you're done with this kit until next time. Okay, so now that we've created a space for the new pads, we need to reinstall the pads. This came from the inside, and I'm going to install it just like this, up and in, okay? All right, so I just went to my tool kit and I pulled out some anti-brake squeak, and I'm going to apply it right where there was an imprint of the caliper. So on this side, it's the caliper, and on the other side, there's the imprint of the piston. And that's where you want to apply the anti-brake squeak, okay? All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and install this pad first, so it'll help me with my orientation when I try to reinstall this pad over here. Okay, so that's how it goes, right? That's the correct orientation. Now there's a little spring that's gonna press against this side right here. And I just need to pull back that spring a little bit and then slide that in, okay? Pulling it back. Okay, that pad is in. And it only goes in one way. So if it goes in, kind of rotate it like that, you're good. So let's go ahead and get this other pad in. I'm gonna do the same thing. Make sure the pad is oriented correctly. And I know I've got some of this anti-squeal getting all over the place, but you notice that I'm not getting it on the front of that pad. And that's what's really important. So, correct orientation. Sometimes you have to use a flat tip screwdriver and just kind of work it in. There you go. So that wasn't the best demonstration, but you guys could see how I use the flat tip screwdriver to kind of push on some of those pinch points and get this brake pad where I wanted it. And that's how it should look, okay? So now we're going to install the piston. Just like that. Remember, we've already lubed up the slides. And that's how it's going to be. It's going to be loose like that for now. Go ahead and tighten up these slide bolts. Probably about 30 foot-pounds on those, but look up the torque specs on your own. They have to be really snug. Once you have all of the brake caliper bolts tightened and the wheel reinstalled, what you'd want to do is back the vehicle up for at least 50 feet, stepping on the brake about every 5 feet. Back step, back step, back step, back step, back step, right? And what that's going to do is reduce the play or the space and the gap that's now remaining between the piston and the pads, okay? So once that's done, now you come back and fill up your brake fluid reservoir. And that wraps up this video. I hope you guys found my tips to be helpful. Please like and subscribe. And until next time, drive defensively.